All ancient DNA studies involve, big teams of folks. So I've been lucky enough to work with a big team to study back in 2019 the genetic history of Rome. So we put together a time transect to sort of track the rise and fall of Rome and the people moving.
In 1963, inside an ordinary limestone cave in Italy, archaeologists found two skeletons locked in what looked like a final embrace. The world called it a 12,000-year-old love story. But when their DNA was finally decoded, it revealed something terrifyingly different. For more than 60 years, we have believed the wrong story. The smaller one nestled comfortably in the arms of the larger one, as if death had come in the middle of an embrace. And locked deep within those bones was something that the science of that time was not yet capable of reaching. DNA that had survived in the two people who had held each other for 12,000 years. When researchers finally decoded it, the result did not just add a footnote to the love story everyone believed. It forced the entire story to be rewritten from the beginning, who these two people really were to each other and what that embrace truly meant. That is what the embrace revealed, going back to one of the most thoroughly studied and oldest human sites in the entire Mediterranean region. The Romo Cave nestles in a limestone cliff of the Lau River Valley in the Calabria region, the southern tip of Italy, inside what is today the Pollino National Park. A narrow fissure opens into mountain with an overhanging rock sheltering the ground. In front and around it there is nothing. No cities, no temples, no sign that if looking only from the outside would show why this place was so important. Yet for thousands of years, from around 17,000 years ago until the Neolithic period, people kept coming back to this cave. And in the final phase of the Upper Paleolithic, it became one of the most important centers of ritual that archaeology has ever discovered in Europe. The first systematic excavation in 1963, led by Paolo Graziosi, one of Italy's leading prehistorians, revealed it all. The first thing to appear was not bones, but a straight engraving on the rock wall, an aurochs bos primigenius, the now extinct giant wild ox carved with astonishing precision. It was one of the most refined, realistic stone artworks remaining from the Upper Paleolithic in Europe, and it led the way to what lay beneath. Over many excavation seasons spanning decades, one grave after another came to light. Up to 9 numbered skeletons, some buried individually, some in pairs. The bodies were sprinkled with red ochre, placed with grave goods and arranged according to rituals repeated across generations. All belonged to a period called the Final Epigean, about 11 to 12,000 years ago. By every measure, Roma was extraordinary. The number of graves, the care of the rituals, the sophistication of the rock art. This was not a place where people lived and happened to bury the dead. This was something greater. A chosen place, a sanctuary, a center that entire communities turned to and returned to for thousands of years. And among all those graves, one stood out and made the world stop later. The grave containing the two people embracing each other, known to science by the simple names Romito I and Romito II. For more than half a century, those two skeletons were studied, measured, and displayed as one of the most important double burials ever found in prehistoric Europe. And everything said about them was based on one thing only: what the naked eye could see. From that a story was built. That was the story in the museums. That was also the story on documentary screens, in newspaper pages, in books placed next to photos of the two embracing skeletons. And it was a love story for more than 60 years. Whenever anyone looked at the posture of those two people, they saw the same thing: an embrace. The smaller skeleton fit into the hollow of the larger one's shoulder, with an arm wrapped around, as if the two bodies had found each other in their final moments and remained that way forever. With an image like that, the conclusion almost presented itself. This must have been a pair of lovers. Two, people who loved each other, died together, and were buried together in each other's arms. A love so strong that even death and 12,000 years could not pull them apart. That idea was so beautiful, it was irresistible. The press called them the Romeo and Juliet of the Ice Age. Museums recreated the pose behind glass for the public to admire, and the image of the two embracing skeletons spread around the world as a symbol of eternal love. Once it became an icon, the image almost protected itself. People printed it, explained it, taught it as a moving testament that love had existed since the dawn of humanity. The more it was retold, the more certain the story became, not because of new evidence, but simply because it was repeated enough. But that love story did not stand alone. It was built on a second assumption, quieter but no less solid. People believed the smaller skeleton was a young man, a youth carrying in his bones the signs of disease that made his body unusually small, and the larger one was an adult woman who had embraced him. A young man and a woman, a romance. The whole picture fit together perfectly, and that very perfection made almost no one thing to question it. Those two people were no longer an open question. They had become an answer, neat, complete, and easy to tell to anyone who walked into the room where they were displayed. The problem was the entire picture was drawn from one thing only, what could be seen and measured: the shape of the skull, the length of the bones, the way the two bodies fit together. A few grave goods. From the posture, people guessed the relationship. From the size of the bones, people guessed the sex. From a few features on the small skeleton, people guessed an entire disease. Each inference was reasonable. Each inference was based on the best tools that archaeology of that time had. But no matter how skilled a naked eye and a measuring tape could only read what the bones showed on the outside. They could not yet reach what lay deep inside them. That was the story in the museum, in the documentaries. And the entire thing was written by the posture of the bones, not by the voice inside them. For the first time in history, scientists had a tool that could hear the actual voice lying deep inside those bones. Ancient DNA. The idea sounded so simple it was almost unbelievable. Genetic material, the same molecule that determines eye color, sex, and thousands of other human traits, does not always completely disappear when a body decomposes. Under the right conditions, a small part can survive for thousands, even tens of thousands of years locked inside the bones. If that remaining DNA could be extracted, sequenced, and compared with the genomes of people living today, a complete biological portrait could be reconstructed, whether they were male or female, who they were related to, where their ancestors came from. Questions that previously could only be guessed from bone shape could now be answered from the information the body itself carried. In every sense, it was a time machine made a bone. But there was one crucial detail. DNA does not exist evenly throughout the skeleton. It degrades quickly in most places. The bone that best preserves genetic material is a small, dense, hard block deep in the inner ear called the petrous bone. It was from that petrous bone that researchers extracted the DNA of the people at Romito, something no tool had been able to touch for decades. And that is why this story could only be rewritten at this moment, not earlier. For nearly the entire 20th century, the technique to do it simply did not exist. Paleogenetics, the science of extracting and decoding DNA from ancient remains, had only matured in the last decade or so, sophisticated enough to read the fragmented code after 12,000 years. And when the research team finally published their findings on the two people at Romeo, they did not publish it in an archaeology journal. They published it in the New England Journal of Medicine, one of the most prestigious medical journals on the planet. That in itself was a clue, because what the DNA was about to reveal did not belong only to the past. It belonged to a field no one had ever thought of when looking at a 12,000-year-old embrace. The bones were finally ready to speak, and the first thing they said was the answer to the most basic question one can ask about a person. Who is this? For many decades, the smaller skeleton, the central figure of the entire story, was believed without doubt to be a young man. No one questioned it. The sex of a skeleton is usually inferred from its shape, the width of the pelvis, the robustness of the skull, the size and ridges where muscles once attached. From those signs, previous generations of researchers had concluded that the smaller one was male, and once labeled a young man, he entered the story with his role already set. But there was a problem that even those researchers knew well. Determining sex from bone shape is one of the most difficult tasks in physical anthropology, and it is especially prone to error when the skeleton belongs to a young person who is not fully developed. In an immature body, the features used to distinguish male from female are still faint and undefined. Even the sharpest eye can misread them, and that is exactly what happened when the DNA was extracted from the petrous bone in the inner ear and decoded. The answer appeared clear, undeniable, independent of how anyone interpreted a ridge on the bone. It lay straight in the chromosomes, and it said something completely different from what the books had said for more than half a century. The smaller skeleton was not a young man. It was a girl, a young woman, a young person placed in the earth with another in an embrace. Let us pause for a moment to feel the weight of this. This was not a minor detail being corrected. This was the central character in one of the most moving stories ever told about prehistory, and for 60 years we had not even known who that person truly was. The book said it was a young man. The DNA said it was a girl, and that was only the easiest part to accept because, after all, a mistake about sex is forgivable. It was not carelessness. It was the real limit of the old tools, and any honest scientist would admit that with such a young skeleton, a mix-up was completely understandable. If the story was only wrong about that, it would still be almost intact. But the problem is that when the first brick of a structure is pulled out, one is forced to look again at all the bricks above it. If for 60 years people had been wrong about the most basic thing, that who this person was, then what else in that story had they also gotten wrong? The young man who had been at the center of a romance had now vanished, and when he vanished, a question immediately appeared where he had stood. If this was not who everyone had believed, then who were these two people in the embrace really to each other? The DNA had one more answer, and this time it would not be something easy to accept. If the discovery about sex only shook one brick, then the second discovery truly forced the entire structure to be rebuilt from the foundation, because the petrous bone in the inner ear does not only preserve information about whether a person is male or female. Locked inside it is the entire nuclear genome, the complete genetic code of a human being. And when that code was read for both individuals, the researchers could ask a question that for 60 years no one had any way to answer. What was the relationship between these two people? The answer did not come from posture, did not come from speculation, did not come from a beautiful story someone wanted to believe. It came directly from the segment of DNA that both shared, and those DNA segments said that the two People in this embrace were not only both female, they were also first degree relatives. In genetics, first degree relatives is the closest level to humans can have to each other besides being the same person, parents, and children or full siblings. The amount of genetic material the two individuals at Romito shared was so large that it could only be explained by one of the deepest blood relationships that exist, and when placed alongside everything already known, a grown adult, a young girl, both female, buried in each other's arms, the most convincing reading became clear. This was a mother and her daughter, not two lovers, a mother and a child. Let that sink in. For more than half a century, these two people had been symbols of romantic love, a pair of lovers, a Romeo and Juliet of the ice. Age, two people who loved each other so much that not even death could separate them. That story did not need to be edited. It simply disappeared. There were no lovers at all. There was no romance at all. There never had been. All those photos that had spread around the world as symbols of eternal love, all those headlines about an immortal romance, all of them had been talking about something that had never existed. And now let us return to the very posture that started it all. The smaller skeleton nestled in the hollow of the larger one's shoulder, one arm wrapped around embracing. For 60 years, every line of that posture had been read as evidence of romantic love, two lovers finding each other in their final moments. But now with a new truth in hand, that same posture tells a completely different story. An adult embracing a child, a larger body, sheltering a smaller one, an arm wrapped around not like a lover's arm, but like a mother's arm around her child. The same bones, the same embrace, but the meaning had completely reversed. It turned out that embrace had never been a love story. It was something much older and much deeper. It was one of the oldest, most universal gestures known to humankind, a mother holding her child. And what makes this moment special is not how strange it is, but how familiar. 12,000 years ago, inside a cave in southern Italy, a mother was there with her daughter, her arm wrapped around the child, exactly the way mothers still hold their children today. The story is not any less moving for losing the romance. If anything, it is even more powerful because a mother's love for her child does not need anyone to believe it in order to be real. But one question still hangs over all of this, because right from the beginning, there was something about the small girl's body that caught the attention of the first researchers, something that up to now had still not been explained. And that is where the DNA was preparing to reveal its most astonishing part, because the same DNA that revealed a mother and a daughter was also preserving something else, a detail that did not lie in the relationship between the two, but inside the body of the girl herself. And this is where the story becomes difficult to tell fully, because to understand it, we must talk about a child, about a disease, and about something that shaped her body even before she was born. Right from the early days of research, there was something about the smaller skeleton that puzzled the experts. The girl was very small, only about 110 centimeters tall, much shorter than a young woman of her age. And it was not just short. Her limbs, her arms, and lower legs were unusually short compared to her torso. For many decades, people suspected she suffered from some form of growth disorder, but the bones alone were not enough to confirm exactly what it was. The skeleton could show the effects of a disease, but it could not name the disease itself. The DNA could. When they read the girl's genome, the research team found a variant in a gene called NPR2, a gene that plays an essential role in bone development. That gene is like an instruction manual telling the body how to lengthen and shape bones throughout growth. When that manual is faulty, the bones stop developing the way they should, and she did not carry just one faulty copy of the gene. She carried two, one from her mother, one from her father, both with the same defect, meeting in the same child. Two faulty copies of NPR2 led to a condition called acromammalic dysplasia, meritotype, an extremely rare genetic disorder characterized by very short stature and pronounced shortening of the limbs. That was exactly what was imprinted on her skeleton. For the first time, a diagnosis that previously could only be guessed was confirmed at the root, at the level of the very code that had built her body. But the genetic story did not stop there. And this is the part that makes it even sharper. The mother, Romito 1, was also shorter than average for her time, standing about 145 cm tall. When her genes were read, the team saw she carried the same NPR2 variant that had caused her daughter's condition, but she carried only one copy, not two, and a single copy causes a much milder effect on height, enough to make her shorter than average, but not to the degree of her daughter. The entire height difference between the two people in the grave, the mother 1 meter 45, the child only 1 meter 10, now had a precise explanation written directly in their genes. The mother carried one copy and passed it on. The child received two copies, one from each side, and bore the full consequences. In a single child, two bloodlines carrying the same mark had met and left that mark even deeper in her than in either of her parents. Think about that for a moment. 12,000 years ago, a woman carrying a small genetic defect that she herself probably did not even know about gave birth to a daughter who inherited it from both sides of the bloodline and carried it in every bone throughout the years she lived. This was not a guess based on the shape of bones. This was a full, specific medical diagnosis of a human being who died 12,000 years ago. And that brings us to an almost unbelievable milestone. This is the earliest known case in the entire history of humankind in which a rare genetic disease was diagnosed at the molecular level, not from symptoms, not from speculation, but from the very mutation that caused it. But a diagnosis, no matter how accurate, only tells us what her body was. It does not yet answer the harder, more human question: what did it mean to live in a body like that, in a world like that? Because this was not our time. This was the end of the Ice Age, a cold and unforgiving world where the survival of an entire community depended on movement, following food sources, crossing treacherous terrain, setting up camp, and breaking it again season after season, in a world that bet everything on legs, on the ability to keep up with the group. A girl with unusually short limbs and small stature would have faced nearly insurmountable obstacles if she had been alone. She could not run as fast as the others. She could not carry loads like the others. She could not keep up by herself with a group moving across harsh land in search of food. And this is what her skeleton says as clearly as anything else. She did not die as a child. She lived into her teenage years. That could only have happened one way. A body like that could not have survived those winters on its own. Someone chose to let her live. Someone brought her food when she could not get it herself. Someone helped her move when the group had to set out. Someone almost clears throat, certainly. Many people over many years decided that her life was worth the extra burden in a world that already had little to spare. And this runs straight into one of the most persistent stereotypes we still hold about our distant ancestors. We often imagine prehistoric people as brutal, living by the law of the strong, abandoning anyone who could not take care of themselves. But the story, written in the bones of the girl at Roma, tells the opposite. These people did not abandon their weakest. They fed her. They carried her. They kept her alive. Through the very world that should have discarded her. They did this not for a day or a season, but continuously year after year until she grew into a young woman. And then when she died, they still did not let go, because the way they buried her is a final proof and perhaps the clearest of how much she meant to them. She was not discarded. She was not left on the margins. Her body was sprinkled with red ochre, a pigment that throughout prehistory was linked to life, to blood, to the most formal rituals for the departed. She was placed with grave goods according to the rites the community reserved for those they valued. The care she received in life did not stop at death. It extended straight into the grave. All of this together paints a portrait that no single skeleton could tell on its own, not the portrait of a victim, but of a loved person, a child whom an entire community chose to keep, to nurture, and finally to send off with all the tenderness they had. And it is right here that a final question begins to emerge, not about her past, but about the distance between her and us, and the answer that the DNA gave to that question is perhaps the most astonishing part of the entire story, because that distance is almost zero. The same mutation on the NPR2 gene that shaped the body of the girl at Ramadou 12,000 years ago is still appearing in people. Today, it is still being found. It is still being diagnosed. Right now, somewhere in the world, there are children who walk into a doctor's office and leave with the exact same diagnosis, name that the DNA assigned to an Ice Age teenager, the same error in the same gene separated by 12,000 years, is still being read in clinics today. Pause for a moment to see how strange that is. A girl who lived at the end of the ice, age and a child born in this century do not just belong to the same species. They carry the same variant in the same gene in the same human genome that both inherited 12,000 years, the entire length of human civilization from the first planted seeds to the day have passed between those two humans. And at the level of the code that makes a person, almost nothing has changed. This opens a door that medicine could barely step through before, because if a rare genetic disease can be recognized in a 12,000-year-old skeleton, then the history of human illness does not begin with the first medical records. It reaches far back into the past, deep into prehistory, deep into the very bodies that have lain in the earth for tens of thousands of years. Paleogenetics can now read those diseases backward through time, tracing their tracks from generation to generation, and begin to rewrite a story that until recently we did not even know existed. The medical history of humankind measured not in centuries but in tens of thousands of years. And this is exactly where the loop closes. From the very beginning, we believe that the two people in that cave were something alien, faint shadows of a primitive past, a lost people so different from us as to be almost unimaginable. But they were not who we thought at the molecular level, the level that truly defines what a human is. That girl was not alien at all. She carried the same genome that you carry. She was vulnerable to exactly the things our own children are still vulnerable to. She was human in the exact same way that we are human. The question was never really how different they were from us. The question was why. It took us so long to realize how close they were. And once we see that, there is one final thing that needs to be said, and it no longer belongs to science. So let us set science aside and return one last time to the embrace where it all began. For more than 60 years, we stood before that image and saw a love story. We saw two lovers, saw longing, saw a love that defied death. But the truth is, all those years, it was not the two people in the grave telling that story. It was us. They had lain silent in the earth, unable to speak, and we had filled their silence with the story we wanted to believe. We called them by names we liked, assigned them a romance we found beautiful, and let that story stand simply because it was more comforting than the absence of answers. We looked in embrace and saw what our hearts longed to see, an epic romance. But what was really their all? That time was something else, closer, more everyday, and in its own way far greater. A mother with her arms wrapped around her child, a child for whom the world had made everything harder than for anyone else, held tightly by the one who had cared for her through every day of her short life, and who then embraced her even when saying goodbye. That is not a love smaller than the story we made up. It is a love older and more enduring than any epic romance, because the love between two lovers can burn bright and then fade. But a mother's love for a child who could not survive on her own is one of the most resilient things humankind has ever known. And it had been right there, right in front of us for more than half a century. We were simply too busy seeing the story we wanted to see and missed the real one lying in that embrace. A story no less beautiful, only more true. Perhaps that is the final thing the two people at Romito left for us. Not a lesson about romantic love, but a reminder that people who lived 12,000 years before us also loved, cared for, and held their children exactly the way we do today. The real mystery of this embrace was never how much they loved each other. It was how long it took us to realize a mother was simply holding her